Morning rush hour was underway at Ploiești's South train station on June 16, 1994, when commuters in the Romanian industrial city noticed a strange, foul-smelling bundle abandoned near a platform. Curiosity turned to horror as the package was opened. Inside were human body parts, carefully wrapped and dumped as if they were garbage. Within hours, authorities were on high alert. This was no ordinary crime scene. It was the beginning of one of the most shocking murder cases the country had ever seen. Over the next day, more grisly bundles surfaced across the city. In vacant lots, at the edge of parks, even alongside quiet residential streets, dismembered remains of what appeared to be the same victim were found. Like many cities emerging from the communist era, Ploiești, located 35 miles north of Bucharest, had been steadily rebuilding itself, its middle-class residents growing accustomed to relative security and peace. Now investigators worked feverishly to collect and document each recovered body part, methodically piecing together evidence of a macabre crime. The discovery sent a wave of anxiety through the community, as violent acts of this nature were practically unheard of in the area. At the morgue, forensic examiners confirmed that the recovered parts belonged to one adult female. The victim's body had been meticulously dismembered with a sharp instrument. Cuts were clean in some places and jagged in others, suggesting a blend of anatomical knowledge and frantic haste. Whoever did this had taken their time to slice the body into pieces, yet they hadn't managed to hide it well enough. Ploiești police now faced a daunting question. Who was the victim, and who could have committed such a gruesome act? Amid the rising panic, a missing person report soon provided a critical clue. A local man, Bogdan Cinteanu, had reported that his wife, Iuliana Cinteanu, hadn't come home on June 16th. Iuliana was a 38-year-old engineer and mother of two. By all accounts, she was responsible, devoted to her family, and not someone who would disappear without word. Bogdan had grown increasingly alarmed when Iuliana failed to return by that evening. He contacted relatives and friends, checked local hospitals, and finally went to the police. Now, 4 days later, the discovery of the mutilated body parts made his worst fears seem likely. Iuliana might have met a violent end. Investigators moved quickly to determine if the dismembered remains could be Iuliana's. The description matched. The victim was a woman in her late 30s, about Iuliana's height and build. Personal items found with the remains provided further hints. On one severed hand, there was a wedding ring engraved with initials matching Iuliana and Bogdan's. Some scraps of clothing among the dumped pieces matched the outfit Iuliana was last seen wearing. Family members were brought in and, in a wrenching moment, helped identify a distinctive piece of jewelry as hers. Within a few hours of the first discovery, police felt almost certain the dismembered woman was Iuliana Cinteanu, the missing engineer and mother of two. The confirmation that the remains belonged to Iuliana sent the community reeling in disbelief. Not only was a beloved wife and mother brutally murdered, but the manner of the crime was practically unheard of. In mid-1990s Romania, violent crime was not as rampant as in some other parts of the world, and dismemberment was something out of lurid horror films, not real life. The news spread quickly around Ploiești. Neighbors, colleagues and friends of Iuliana were aghast. How could this happen, and why? Who would want to kill Iuliana, a seemingly ordinary professional and family woman, in such a ghastly way? For the police, identifying the victim was just the beginning. Now they needed to retrace Iuliana's final hours to figure out how she ended up as pieces scattered around the city. Investigators began interviewing family and friends to build a timeline of June 16, 1994, the day Iuliana went missing, and likely the day she was killed. Bogdan, her husband, recounted everything he knew. That morning, Iuliana had left home around 9 a.m. after receiving a phone call. She had mentioned to him that she was going to see a friend who could help her get some routine blood tests done. Juliana had recently needed some medical laboratory analyses. When she found the public clinic too busy, she decided to ask a friend for help. Being an engineer, she had a circle of educated friends. One of them was a doctor who had offered to draw her blood and handle the tests as a favor. According to Bogdan, Juliana's plan for June 16th was simple. Stop by her friend's apartment in the morning for the blood sample, then head to work afterwards. It shouldn't have taken long. When she didn't show up at work or return home, alarm bells rang. By afternoon, Bogdan tried calling their close friends, including the doctor friend she was supposed to meet, but couldn't reach her. As hours passed with no word from Juliana, Bogdan's concern turned into panic. By that night, he contacted the police to report her missing. This timeline gave detectives a crucial lead. Juliana's last known whereabouts were at the home of her friend, a doctor. That friend was Dr. Roxana Kalin, a 35-year-old pediatrician. Roxana was not a stranger. In fact, she and her husband were part of the same social circle as Juliana and Bogdan. They had known each other for years and often spent time together. It was only natural that Juliana would trust Roxana to help with medical tests. The morning of June 16th, Juliana had gone to Roxana's apartment for that purpose. What happened afterward was a mystery. Police knew that the last person to see a victim alive can often be the key to the case. At minimum, Roxana was an important witness who might help reconstruct Juliana's movements. When contacted, Roxana did something curious. She readily cooperated and came in to give a statement, but her demeanor raised some eyebrows. She appeared shaken by the news of Juliana's death, as anyone would be. Yet there was an odd mix of nervousness and composure in her responses. She admitted that yes, Juliana had come by that morning for a blood draw. Roxana claimed she took a sample of Juliana's blood in her apartment around 10 a.m. Then Juliana left shortly thereafter, supposedly heading to work. Roxana said that was the last time she saw her friend. On the surface, nothing sounded amiss in Roxana's recounting. Two friends meet, conduct a quick errand, and part ways. It was plausible. If that story were true, something terrible must have befallen Juliana after she left Roxana's building. Perhaps she was attacked on the street or abducted while walking to her car. The neighborhood, however, was a busy central area, and a daylight kidnapping or murder outdoors would be risky and likely noticed. Still, investigators couldn't rule anything out yet. They began canvassing the route from Roxana's apartment to where Juliana would likely go next. No witnesses recalled seeing an attack or hearing screams around that time. No signs of a struggle were found on the sidewalks or parking lot. It was as if Juliana had vanished into thin air after leaving the doctor's home. Detectives were not satisfied. They needed to double back and examine that apartment more closely. Was it possible that foul play had occurred indoors, at the very place Juliana was last seen? As police delved deeper, the relationship between Juliana and Roxana came under scrutiny. The two women were known to be friends. They had met through their husbands, since both couples traveled in the same social circle of educated professionals. Throughout the late 1980s and early 90s, the Kalin family, Roxana and her husband Doru, both physicians, and the Tsintianu family, Juliana and Bogdan, an engineer and an architect, were part of a tight-knit group of 5 couples. They vacationed together, celebrated holidays, and spent weekends playing bridge or having dinners. By all outward appearances, Juliana and Roxana were good friends. They went shopping together and even took aerobics classes side by side. However, as investigators soon learned, beneath the friendly camaraderie lay fault lines of jealousy and betrayal. The picture-perfect friendship had been fractured by an affair. In May 1993, about a year before the murder, Roxana and Bogdan, Juliana's husband, had begun a secret extramarital relationship. What started subtly, stolen glances at gatherings, a deepening connection, eventually grew into a full-fledged romance carried out behind their spouses' backs. They were careful, meeting only briefly in private and often in the presence of others to avoid suspicion. For a time, they succeeded. None of their mutual friends noticed the spark between them. But secrets have a way of coming to light. After a few months of the affair, Roxana became pregnant with Bogdan's child, This development forced the lovers to confront the reality of their situation. According to later testimony, Roxana and Bogdan discussed the possibility of divorcing their respective spouses and making a life together. Bogdan, however, got cold feet. He had 2 children with Juliana and a standing in the community. Leaving his wife was not so simple. He begged Roxana to end the pregnancy, promising that maybe someday they could be together, but not now. Reluctantly, Roxana agreed and had an abortion. They continued their affair in secret, but this episode sowed seeds of bitterness and uncertainty. Roxana, by now deeply in love, believed Bogdan had promised to marry her eventually. She held on to that hope even as Bogdan wavered. By the start of 1994, hints of the illicit romance had begun to surface. One fateful day, Roxana's mother-in-law, who happened to share a telephone line with her son's family, accidentally overheard a flirtatious phone conversation between Roxana and Bogdan. Realizing at once what was happening, the older woman informed both her son, Roxana's husband, Doru, and Juliana about the suspected affair. As one would expect, confrontation followed. In January 1994, Juliana and Bogdan faced each other in a painful conversation, and Roxana was confronted by her own husband as well. Yet, in an astonishing display of denial, both Roxana and Bogdan vehemently denied any improper relationship. Bogdan managed to convince Juliana that any affection he showed Roxana was just friendly, nothing more. Roxana likewise placated her husband, blaming rumors and misunderstandings. The crisis passed, but not without lingering suspicion. Juliana was not entirely convinced by her husband's denials, and Roxana knew it. The friend group tried to maintain normalcy. They still met at parties and gatherings, but under the surface, tensions simmered. At one party in February 1994, a friend noticed Roxana standing off to the side, glaring at Juliana and Bogdan as the married couple danced together. Roxana's intense stare and uncharacteristic withdrawal caught attention. Later that night, an annoyed Roxana cut in to dance with Bogdan, whispering something to him that made him turn visibly grim. Shortly after, Juliana confided to a close girlfriend that Roxana had shown unbelievable nerve. Apparently, Bogdan revealed that Roxana scolded him for being too affectionate with his own wife on the dance floor. It was a brazen remark that shocked Juliana. In that moment, any doubts Juliana had about the affair were likely erased. Roxana's jealousy was on full display. Not long after that incident, Juliana reportedly told the same girlfriend, "Roxana is so diabolical that if she could, she would kill me." It was a statement made half in anger, half in fear. Juliana even described a recent interaction that deeply unsettled her. Roxana had recommended that Juliana and Bogdan watch a film titled At the Crossroads Between Love and Death. In that movie's plot, a married architect with a child is torn between his wife and his lover. In the end, unable to live without the mistress, he leaves his wife for her. Juliana interpreted Roxana's recommendation of this film as a message, a taunt that Bogdan truly loved Roxana and would eventually choose her. This mind game made Juliana realize just how far Roxana might be willing to go. By the spring of 1994, the situation among the trio was untenable. Roxana became pregnant a second time by Bogdan and underwent another quiet abortion. The emotional stakes were sky high. Roxana felt she had sacrificed greatly for this love, and yet Bogdan still hadn't left his wife. Juliana, for her part, was growing increasingly anxious about her husband's fidelity and her own safety. There were likely fierce arguments between Juliana and Bogdan behind closed doors. It's believed that at some point, Juliana threatened to expose the affair to Roxana's husband, Doru, if Bogdan didn't end it once and for all. The pressure on all sides was mounting. This fraught context cast new light on the events of June 16th, 1994. Juliana going to Roxana's apartment for a blood test suddenly seemed less routine and more ominous. Investigators had to consider, was Juliana lured there under false pretenses? Could this meeting have been a setup for something far more sinister? Investigators began methodically collecting evidence and interrogating both Bogdan and Roxana. Bogdan was brought in for extensive questioning. He was distraught over his wife's death and now extremely nervous as the veil on his affair was torn away. He admitted to the adultery, which was incriminating morally but not proof of murder. Detectives pressed him on his actions the day of Juliana's disappearance. Bogdan insisted he was at work that morning, not with Juliana. He claimed he had no idea Roxana planned to meet Juliana for any blood test, and that he had been in the dark about their meeting. Investigators checked Bogdan's alibi. Colleagues did recall seeing him at the architecture office that day, which provided some support that he wasn't at the crime scene. Still, the possibility remained that he could have been involved indirectly or after the fact. Meanwhile, the evidence trail at Roxana's apartment started to speak for itself. Forensic technicians conducted a luminol test and detailed search of her bathroom and other areas. Blood traces were found in the grout around the bathtub and in some hard-to-reach crevices, suggesting a significant amount of blood had been spilled and only partially cleaned up. In the drain, tiny bits of human tissue and blood residue were detected. No amount of scrubbing could erase all signs of the carnage that had occurred there. It was becoming clear that Juliana had been killed and dismembered in Roxana's own bathroom, the very location where she had gone for a benign medical procedure. Confronted with this damning physical evidence, Roxana could no longer maintain that Juliana simply left her apartment alive. The story changed. Roxana broke down and confessed that Juliana had in fact died in her home, but she wove a dramatic story of a medical emergency gone wrong. According to Roxana's new account, the two women had been conversing in the apartment when suddenly Juliana became extremely agitated. Roxana claimed that Juliana started yelling and insulting her, and then Juliana allegedly collapsed in some sort of hysterical or fainting episode. As a doctor, Roxana said she tried to help by giving Juliana an injection to calm her down. Roxana conveniently noted that she had access to strong sedatives and had one on hand. The tale grew more bizarre. Roxana asserted that the injection accidentally made Juliana lose consciousness and possibly stop breathing. Panicking, Roxana dragged her friend into the bathroom in an attempt to revive her. She claimed that believing Juliana's airway was blocked, she attempted an emergency tracheotomy, cutting into Juliana's throat with a knife to help her breathe. In Roxana's telling, this was when everything went irreversibly wrong. The neck cut bled profusely, and Juliana died from the injury. Overwhelmed with shock at what she'd done, Roxana said she was paralyzed for a time, sitting in the bathroom with her friend's lifeless body, not knowing what to do next. It was a grotesque narrative, but one that tried to frame the incident as a tragic accident rather than premeditated murder. Roxana admitted to dismembering Juliana's corpse, a fact she could hardly deny given the evidence, but portrayed it as a panicked act to dispose of a body from an unintended death. She insisted she had not planned to kill Juliana at all. Investigators and forensic experts were highly skeptical of this version of events. They began to pick it apart with the facts. There were no signs that Juliana had any medical condition or acute event that would cause her to suddenly collapse. She was a healthy adult with no known heart issues or similar problems. Roxana's story about giving an injection did align with one thing. As a pediatrician, she had access to drugs. Later, a hospital assistant even recalled that Roxana had obtained a vial of a powerful anesthetic from the hospital a couple of months before. Roxana claimed this was the sedative she injected Juliana with to calm her down. However, forensic toxicology on Juliana's tissues found no trace of the anesthetic or any other common poison or drug in her system. If Roxana did inject her, the dose might have been too low, or the drug had metabolized by the time tests were done. The medical examiner noted that given the condition of the remains and how the drug dissipates, they could not entirely rule out that an anesthetic had been used. But crucially, the syringe and vial that Roxana would have used were nowhere to be found, and suspiciously, the specific spot on Juliana's arm where an injection would have left a mark had been excised from the flesh, cut away during the dismemberment. It looked like someone intentionally removed potential evidence of an injection. The autopsy findings were crystal clear. Juliana had died from massive blood loss due to a deep cut across her neck. The wound had cleanly severed her jugular vein and carotid artery, vital blood vessels in the throat. This was no small incision. It was a lethal gash. For Roxana's emergency tracheotomy story to hold water, one would have to believe that a trained doctor somehow miscalculated so badly that she sliced open the very vessels she should avoid in a tracheotomy. In court, a prosecutor grilled Roxana on this point. You had a top grade in anatomy. How could a doctor who excelled in anatomy not know they were cutting through the jugular and carotid? Roxana had no convincing answer. Beyond the injection supplies, investigators uncovered other items in Roxana's possession that raised eyebrows. During a search of her apartment, they found several vials of strychnine poison stashed away. Strychnine is a deadly toxin with no medical use in a pediatrician's practice. Why did Roxana have such a stockpile of poison? One can only speculate, perhaps a backup plan if the injection failed. Additionally, the meticulous way she had dismembered and packaged the body and the attempt to clean the scene suggested a level of foresight and coolness at odds with her claim of an impromptu panic. As evidence was sorted, a narrative of premeditated murder began to solidify. Investigators surmised that Roxana had lured Juliana to her home on the pretext of helping with blood tests, a convenient excuse given Roxana's profession and their friendship. Once Juliana was in her grasp, Roxana likely administered an injection of a sedative to quickly incapacitate her victim. This would prevent Juliana from fighting back or escaping. Then, with a sharp knife at the ready, Roxana coldly slashed Juliana's throat, cutting deep enough to ensure she would bleed to death in minutes. It was a calculated way to kill swiftly and relatively quietly. No gunshots, likely muffled screams if any. But the hardest part was yet to come. Roxana now had a corpse in her apartment, a big problem. She chose a horrifying solution: dismember the body into smaller pieces that could be disposed of in separate locations, making it harder to trace or even identify. She pulled the body into the bathroom, perhaps because it had surfaces that were easier to wash down and a drain for blood. Using surgical precision mixed with frenzied determination, the doctor systematically cut up her former friend. It's hard to imagine the emotional state required to perform such an act. Whether fueled by adrenaline, rage, or a chilling detachment, Roxana went through with it. At one point during this gruesome task, Roxana realized her young son was due home. In a disturbing detail, she actually left the body parts in progress in the bathroom and stepped out to intercept her child. She told her son, who was playing outside, to stay out longer, giving him permission to play until 1 p.m. before coming back in. This ensured the child would not walk in on the nightmarish scene inside the apartment. Roxana even took the moment to buy some newspapers and garbage bags, likely to wrap and transport the remains. The banality of these actions, pausing in the middle of dismemberment to do errands and check on her child, is chilling. It shows a killer compartmentalizing her life. One moment chopping up a body, the next acting like a normal mother at the park. Throughout the day, and possibly into the night of June 16th, Roxana packaged the body parts into several bundles using bags and newspaper. She worked alone, cleaning as she went. However, disposing of the evidence proved tricky. A lone woman lugging heavy parcels dripping blood would attract notice, so she had to be cautious. Over the next day or two, Roxana surreptitiously deposited the packages at various points around town. She may have driven her car under cover of darkness to drop some at the train station and others on the outskirts of Ploiești. One by one, she rid her home of the physical evidence of the crime, or so she thought. Despite Roxana's efforts to scrub her apartment and scatter Juliana's remains, traces of the crime persisted. Some bloodstains and tissue remained, detectable to forensic investigators. And Roxana made a critical mistake. In her haste, or perhaps due to sheer fatigue and mental overload, she forgot some of the incriminating evidence in her own home. In the kitchen freezer of her refrigerator, carefully wrapped in a plastic bag, lay a gruesome cache, Juliana's internal organs. Roxana had placed Juliana's heart, liver, lungs, and other organs in her freezer, possibly intending to dispose of them later when she had a chance. But events moved faster. By the time she might have returned to that task, the investigation was closing in on her. In fact, The police initially missed this hidden package during their first searches of the apartment. It wasn't until roughly 2 weeks after the murder that the oversight came to light. And it came from an unexpected source: Roxana's own husband, Dr. Doru Kalin. Doru had been away much of the time. He worked in Bucharest and presumably was not home during the incident. After Roxana's arrest, Doru returned to their apartment and made a startling discovery in the freezer: a solid, frozen block wrapped in plastic. Peeling it open, he was greeted with the sight of human organs. Shocked and horrified, he immediately notified the authorities. Investigators rushed back in to collect this evidence they had overlooked. Along with the organs, other evidence that had slipped through the initial crime scene processing came out. Doru also found bloodied plastic bags tucked away in a closet, and those vials of strychnine mentioned earlier. These items, once handed to the prosecution, further solidified the case against Roxana. The forgotten organs in particular were a damning piece of proof. They underscored how hasty and incomplete Roxana's cleanup had been, and they contradicted her narrative of a panicked but innocent attempt to save Iuliana. Innocent people don't hide organs in the freezer. Meanwhile, by late June 1994, with Roxana under arrest and confessing, albeit with her spin on the story, Bogdan was also in custody. For a short time, police detained Bogdan as a suspect, uncertain of his role. There were a few reasons they initially eyed him with suspicion. First, statistics. In murders of women, husbands are often involved. Second, a handkerchief bearing Bogdan's initials had been found in Roxana's apartment, potentially stained with blood. That looked bad, suggesting he might have been present during the crime. Bogdan explained it could have been left there from an earlier visit, not necessarily on the murder day. Third, some of Iuliana's valuable jewelry was missing from the recovered remains. Items she was known to wear, like earrings and rings, aside from the wedding band identified, were not initially accounted for. Investigators wondered if the murder could have included a staged robbery element, or if someone kept those items. The possibility that Bogdan and Roxana plotted the murder together, perhaps to make it look like a robbery, or to remove Iuliana and start a new life, had to be considered. Ultimately, as evidence was sorted, Bogdan's involvement became less plausible. The missing jewelry turned out not to implicate him. In fact, Roxana had thrown those pieces away along with body parts, and some were later recovered or confirmed lost. There was nothing concrete tying Bogdan to the act, apart from his affair and the circumstantial handkerchief. By February 1995, after months in limbo, charges against Bogdan were dropped and he was released from custody. Investigators concluded that while Bogdan's infidelity set the stage, he did not participate in the killing or dismemberment of his wife. The focus now was squarely on Dr. Roxana Kalin, who was already being dubbed in the press as Doktorica Ucigașa, the killer doctor. Public interest in the case exploded. Romania in the mid-90s didn't yet have 24/7 cable news or social media, but newspapers and TV and radio talk shows provided extensive coverage. People lined up to buy papers carrying lurid details of the crime. The sensational elements, a love triangle, a respectable female doctor turned butcher, body parts strewn about a city, made it a morbidly fascinating affair. Some compared it to the Western tabloids' frenzy over the O.J. Simpson case happening around the same time, although here the individuals were not celebrities. They were ordinary middle-class professionals, which in some ways made it even more frightening. If someone like Roxana could commit such a crime, what lurked behind the polite facades of others? Roxana Kalin remained in custody as the investigation progressed to a formal prosecution. The Romanian justice system would eventually have to unravel fact from fiction in a trial that riveted the nation. In the lead-up, more insights emerged about Roxana's state of mind and the meticulous lengths she went to in planning the murder, which countered her portrayal of an impromptu, heat-of-the-moment tragedy. One revealing fact was how Roxana had arranged for Iuliana to come over in the first place. Iuliana genuinely did need some lab tests done and had been turned away from a busy clinic, Poliklinika Praga, in town. Roxana seized on this need and offered her services, telling Iuliana she could draw the blood at home and take it to the lab. It was an offer made seemingly out of friendship, but in hindsight, it was the perfect trap. Choosing a weekday morning for the appointment was deliberate. Roxana's own 2 children would be at school or out playing, and her husband was away at work, so no one else would be in the apartment. The timing also likely ensured that Juliana's husband Bogdan would be at his office, eliminating any immediate interference or anyone noticing Juliana's prolonged absence until later in the day. Investigators found that Roxana had prepared her apartment for the crime. Plastic sheets or extra linens were probably laid out, though many were discarded. Evidence such as bloodied bags and cleaning items were left behind. The murder weapon, a solid kitchen knife or scalpel, was presumably readied, and the drugs, the thiopental anesthetic, and possibly the presence of strychnine, indicated a premeditated decision to immobilize or kill in a certain way. Roxana likely considered poisoning Juliana to death quietly, but ultimately she went with a combination of injection and throat slitting. As the forensic evidence piled up, Roxana's defense strategy began to take shape. She obtained a high-profile attorney, Paula Jacob, known for taking on tough cases. Roxana's legal team signaled that they would not dispute that she caused Juliana's death, but they would contest the nature of the act, specifically arguing against premeditation. If they could convince the court that Roxana acted in a moment of panic or temporary insanity, perhaps the charge could be reduced from aggravated, premeditated murder to a lesser form of homicide. The public, however, was largely unsympathetic. Rumors swirled that Roxana might attempt an insanity defense. The fact that some body parts were never found, 2 packages remained missing, and that Roxana claimed not to remember where she threw them only added to the dark mystique of the case. Many assumed it was an act, that she was feigning memory loss to seem traumatized. In Ploiești, gossip even circulated, taking bets on whether Roxana would be declared mentally unfit to stand trial. The collective sentiment was that she knew exactly what she was doing. When the case finally went to trial in 1995, the courtroom was packed at every hearing. Spectators, journalists, and even curious lawyers who had no involvement crowded in to witness the proceedings. It was standing room only. The spectacle of this well-educated woman, now an accused butcher, was irresistible. In those days, Romanian courts even allowed photographers, so images of Roxana in the dock appeared in the press. She hardly looked like the stylish, confident pediatrician friends once knew. Roxana cut a demure figure at trial. She had dyed her blonde hair to a muted brown and often covered her head with a simple white kerchief. She wore a plain pink turtleneck and her prison-issue coat at each appearance, trying to present herself as subdued and repentant. On the witness stand and in her statements, Roxana accepted full responsibility for killing Juliana. She tearfully apologized to Juliana's mother and children, expressing remorse. However, she still did not provide a clear, honest account of how the murder was carried out. Key questions, exactly what transpired in that apartment, step by step, remained murky because Roxana stuck to her story of it being an accident after an injection went awry. She offered no explanation for the presence of strychnine in her home, nor could she adequately explain away the methodical dismemberment beyond saying she panicked. The prosecutors, on the other hand, laid out their case for premeditation. They highlighted every incriminating element: the luring to the apartment on false pretenses, the procurement of drugs in advance, the forensic evidence of an intentional throat cut, and the extensive cleanup and disposal operation afterwards. They painted Roxana as an intelligent but ruthless woman who chose murder as a solution to her marital and romantic entanglements. The motive was clear as day: to eliminate Juliana and clear the path for a life with Bogdan, whether or not Bogdan had actually intended to follow through with that plan. One dramatic moment in the trial came when forensic experts testified about the condition of the body and the crime scene. They explained how blood spatter and stains, or lack thereof, in certain areas, could tell the position of assailant and victim during the fatal blow. Unfortunately, the initial crime scene investigation had been botched in some respects. Because crucial evidence, like the organs in the freezer, was found weeks later, the defense could argue that the scene wasn't properly preserved. However, Enough data was collected to surmise that Juliana was likely subdued or unconscious when her neck was cut, because there were no signs of a struggle or defensive wounds. This matched the scenario of a surprise injection and attack. The prosecution also underscored the sheer amount of planning that must have gone into a crime of this nature. They called out that Roxana even changed her appearance afterwards, dyeing her hair, as if trying to reinvent herself or hide in plain sight. While out on bail prior to trial, she had kept mostly silent and reclusive, giving no interviews, perhaps under advice of counsel. The media speculated endlessly. Was she remorseful or just calculating her next move? During the trial, Roxana's defense attorney, Paula Jacob, argued that Roxana acted under an emotional short circuit. She described Roxana as a woman driven to desperation by a failing marriage and a tumultuous affair, essentially claiming that a moment of madness overcame her, not a cold-blooded scheme. Jacob emphasized Roxana's previously clean record, her career as a caring doctor, and the notion that this was completely out of character, triggered by an extreme situation. Perhaps, Jacob suggested, the constant stress of the love triangle and personal problems led to a mental breakdown. The court listened to all sides over many sessions. Witnesses from the friend group testified, including the one who recounted Juliana's chilling statement that, if Roxana could, she'd kill me. Bogdan testified as well, likely a humiliating ordeal as he had to recount the affair and its fallout in a public forum. He admitted to his broken promises to Roxana and how Juliana had grown fearful. Bogdan denied any involvement in or knowledge of the murder plot, and nothing contradicted that, so he was essentially a witness and a bereaved husband at the same time. A complicated position. Another powerful piece of evidence was Juliana's cause of death, as established by the autopsy report. The medical examiner's conclusion left no ambiguity. Juliana died from a violent neck slashing, which was a deliberate act. The wounds were vital, inflicted while she was alive, not post-mortem. This undercut any argument that maybe Juliana had died of a drug overdose or other cause and was only dismembered after. No, she was killed by that knife wound. And who held the knife? All signs pointed to Roxana. As the trial unfolded, the narrative of what truly happened solidified, and the perpetrator's identity was laid bare. It was now undeniable that Dr. Roxana Kalin, the trusted friend and pediatrician, was the murderer. Piece by piece, like assembling a macabre jigsaw, the full picture emerged for the court. Roxana exploited Juliana's need for a medical test to draw her into a private setting. This meeting was arranged days in advance, showing forethought. Roxana had obtained a potent anesthetic and possessed other poisons. She cleared her home of witnesses and had tools ready. This was not a spur-of-the-moment fight. It was a setup. Once Juliana was in Roxana's apartment, Roxana likely confronted her about the affair and whatever ultimatum Juliana had given. At some point, Roxana injected Juliana, overpowering her in a deceitful manner, coming at her under the guise of a helpful act, but delivering a disabling dose. With Juliana weakened or unconscious, Roxana then took a knife and slashed her throat deeply, ensuring death. Roxana immediately moved the body to the bathroom and commenced cutting it into pieces. She was a medical school graduate. She knew human anatomy intimately. This knowledge could only have made her more efficient at dissection. The gruesome task likely took hours. She severed limbs, cut through joints, and sectioned the torso, draining blood as she went. Roxana cleaned up the scene as best she could. She wrapped body parts in plastic and newspaper. Perhaps she hoped that without an intact corpse, authorities might take much longer to identify the victim or determine the cause of death, buying her time or even causing the investigation to falter. Over a short span, Roxana transported and dumped the packages of remains around the city. She took care to spread them out, as if trying to ensure the packages wouldn't be found all at once. It's possible she chose places meaningful to throwing investigators off, a train station, and remote areas where animals or decay might damage evidence. Despite her careful planning, Roxana made errors. Blood traces in her home pointed to it as the crime scene. She overlooked the organs in her freezer in the chaos. She left behind identifiable personal items and other pieces that tied her to the crime. And crucially, she underestimated law enforcement's ability to piece together her relationship to the victim. Once detectives learned Juliana's last stop was Roxana's home and uncovered the love triangle, the facade of mere friendship crumbled. When Roxana's guilt became evident, the question ceased to be, who did it, and became, with what intent did she do it? The court had to decide on the degree of murder. In December 1995, a year and a half after the murder, the primary trial court reached a decision. The judges agreed with the prosecution. This was premeditated murder. They reclassified the charge formally to murder with premeditation during the trial, rejecting the defense's pleas for a lesser charge. Roxana Kalin was convicted of qualified murder and desecration of a corpse for the dismemberment. Her sentence, 22 years in prison, plus an additional 10-year denial of certain civil rights after release. The courtroom was tense as the verdict was read. There was no jury. Romanian courts use panels of judges, but the public spectators erupted in a buzz at the outcome. Some felt 22 years was too lenient for such a heinous act, muttering that she deserved life or even the death penalty, which had been abolished a few years prior, after the fall of communism. The prosecution had indeed initially secured, essentially, a life-equivalent sentence. Roxana showed little reaction as the decision was announced, apart from tears. Perhaps at that point, she was resigned to her fate. Roxana's legal team appealed the conviction to higher courts, as expected. The case went up to the Court of Appeal in Ploiești, which upheld the verdict, and then to the Romanian Supreme Court. In February 1997, the Supreme Court gave the final word, confirming the 22-year prison sentence. All appeals exhausted, Roxana Kalin was definitively condemned for the murder of Iuliana Tânteanu. During those appeal hearings, more of Roxana's personality came into public view. Her star attorney Paula Jacob argued fiercely on points of law and mental state, but to no avail. The Supreme Court justices were not swayed by arguments of a momentary short circuit in Roxana's mind. They saw a deliberate act and upheld the punishment. With the case closed, the sensational headlines gradually faded, but the story remained etched in the public consciousness as perhaps Romania's most infamous crime of passion in modern times. One surprising element of the post-trial period was that Roxana never truly spoke out to give her own full version or remorse beyond what was said in court. She granted no interviews, wrote no memoir, and generally kept silent behind bars. Some wondered if she was protecting someone, perhaps still shielding Bogdan from any implication, or maybe protecting her own family from further embarrassment. Others thought she was simply unable to confront the reality of her deeds out loud. Psychologists who commented on the case in the media speculated on Roxana's psyche. Here was a woman who by all accounts had been a model citizen, a doctor who cared for children, a mother of two, an educated and sociable person, who committed a barbaric act. What switch flipped inside her? The prevailing theory was that Roxana became obsessed with the idea of being with Bogdan and spiraled into an irrational state where eliminating Iuliana appeared to be the only solution. Jealous love can be a powerful, destructive force, and Roxana was caught in its grip. However, her methodical approach to the killing indicated that she was still very much in control of her faculties in planning and executing the crime. It was the ultimate paradox. Love drove her to it, but cold logic saw it through. The aftermath for the families was heartbreaking on all sides. Iuliana's two young children had lost their mother in an unimaginably violent way. They were suddenly left with only their father, who himself had to live with guilt. After all, it was his affair that set these events in motion. How does a family cope with that? Reports suggest that Bogdan Tânteanu dedicated himself to raising his kids and rebuilding a life out of the public eye. It's likely he faced resentment or blame from Iuliana's relatives, even if he wasn't legally culpable. His choices had tragic consequences. As for Roxana's family, her husband Doru divorced her while she was in prison, a not unexpected outcome. He was left to raise their two children, who had to grow up knowing that their mother killed someone and was incarcerated. One can only imagine the trauma and bullying they might have faced. Doru continued his medical career and by all accounts was a victim in his own way. He not only lost his wife, figuratively, to this crime, but he was the one who stumbled on the horrifying leftovers in the freezer, an image that likely haunted him. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, other news stories came and went, but the case of Roxana Kalin remained a reference point in Romanian true crime lore. It was often cited in magazines and TV shows recapping famous crimes. Yet, outside of Romania, the case remained largely obscure. Inside the penitentiary, Roxana was reportedly a model prisoner. She kept her head down, avoided trouble, and even helped mediate conflicts among inmates, drawing on her authoritative demeanor as a doctor. She served her time at the Tagshaw prison for women. Due to her good behavior, she became eligible for conditional release after serving 2/3 of her sentence, as Romanian law allows. In early 2009, after approximately 14 years behind bars, a parole board granted her release. She walked out of prison in March 2009, a free woman years earlier than the original sentence dictated. The news of Roxana's release stirred up a brief renewed interest in the case. Some felt that justice was cut short. 14 years served for the brutal murder and mutilation of Iuliana seemed insufficient. But the law was the law, and she had met the requirements for release. Upon gaining freedom, Roxana, now in her 60s, slipped into quiet anonymity. She did not seek out publicity or attempt to profit from her infamy. In fact, reports indicated she wished to live in total discretion. She had to build a new life, likely under a changed name, far from Ploiești. Whether her children welcomed her back or kept their distance is not publicly known. Bogdan Sinteanu, for his part, never had any further known contact with Roxana after the trial. He had moved on as best he could. Reflecting on this case today, several decades later, it stands as a cautionary tale of how a seemingly ordinary domestic situation can explode into extraordinary violence. Indeed, Roxana Kalin's name will forever be associated with the gruesome act she committed. She has been called many things in the press: the Ploiești murderer, the killer doctor, and the perpetrator of the most shocking crime of passion in Romania. These labels encapsulate her infamy, but they also serve as a stark reminder that evil can wear an everyday face: a doctor, a mother, a friend, and a murderer. As a final note in this tragic tale, it's worth recognizing how rare it is. Female perpetrators of such violent murders are uncommon, and among them, dismemberment is rarer still. Roxana's case thus occupies a dubious place in criminal history. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How well do we know those around us? And what darkness might desperation reveal in someone we'd least expect? Thank you so much for listening. If these types of rarely reported solved global murder cases interest you, please consider subscribing. We very much appreciate it. We'll be releasing 2 compelling episodes a week, and we're just getting started.